Thanks, everybody. It's lovely to have you here. Thank you for coming. I can see in front of me people from as far away as Warrnambool and Poland and Melton and other places like that. Thank you in particular to the locals who are here, because I know that if you're here, you've given up something very, very important. And in particular, I thank the Mayor and Jeanette for being here today. One of the ideas we had with this chapel when we fixed it up after its leaks and whatnot was to use it for things other than funerals. So we wanted to have some beautiful things happening here. So we probably won't be having things that are very loud and very late at night, because our bedroom's up there. But we would like to have more events like this where writers or musicians or photographers come and do their thing. So that would be just a nice way of using the space. Because as those of you who live in Terang know, there are not very many very small funerals. Mainly they're very big, generous funerals that need to happen elsewhere. And I think one of the things about being lucky enough to buy a business like McQueen's and to live in a place like this is that you have a bit of responsibility to care for it. So we feel pretty happy with the way things are going at the moment, but it's just ours for a very short time, and then as history goes on, it will be someone else's to care for and leave for the next generation. But what I'd like to do now is introduce you to the Mayor, Councillor Chris O'Connor, and he's going to speak to you and reopen our chapel. So thanks.
Well, thanks very much, Anne and Steve, for asking me along. So it's really good to do these sort of things, these little events that mean so much to your residents. And I know to Anne and Steve put a lot of time and effort and commitment into this place, and we're really pleased at Terang that you have, Anne, because I do remember when you first came and running into you and telling you what a good place Terang was and a good place to reside. You sort of weren't sure at the time, and you're an old Camperdown girl. We're really pleased that you've decided to make Terang your home and decided that you've decided to invest into quite a historic sort of a place. I mean, if you cast your mind to what would have happened in a place like this over many, many years, it is quite an historical place, and it's really good that you've been prepared to invest into it and use local tradesmen. Jeanette's brother Gary and Gary Crimmins, Paul Healy, my Donia Painting and Lush Events sort of helped out as well. So it's really good that you were able to use those local trades and put some of your hard-earned, back into a pretty much a Terang iconic little place, I guess. And I think to be able to, your idea of using it as a quiet place and, an artistic, or cultural event is wonderful, and it does give someone an opportunity. I understand that you're not particularly wanting to rent it out or anything, you just love it to be used for those types of events. So I think it's really good and kind, and I know from recent events how important it is to have, funeral directors that do care and that your commitment to the community, and whilst, things that happen around funeral parlours or undertaking businesses, what can be really stressful, you're dedicated to make it as good an experience as it can be, and you're good, kind people and great to deal with, so we appreciate that. So I suppose I could say to reopen the place or to celebrate the renovations. I'm really happy and pleased to be able to do that, and just good to have people that are dedicated to our area, and it's very nice of people to turn up, and I'm sure there'll be quite a good, I think it's a reading or whatever, I'm sure it'll be fantastic. So really pleased to be here and able to basically reopen the premises. So thanks very much for asking me.
Chris, just before you leave, we have a lucky door prize, and I'm wondering if you'd draw it. The actual prize, I should point out, is an RSL rose. If anyone doesn't want the rose, Just
do that. We've just got a couple more things.
sorry. And latecomers, we'll put them on.
So probably just
joking.
should have also said the I know the door prize going to the local for the bus up at Mount View, which is a great cause too. So very generous as well too. And for that, thank goodness it's not me. It is Kath Garner, is it?
Kath, someone who's travelled from Warrnambool, so that's really nice. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And now to the most important event of the day, to introduce Robert Lewis. I first heard Robert speak about the book in Ballarat last year. We saw it advertised and thought that looked really interesting. And then we discovered we had a personal family connection with one of the men that he was writing about, so it became a lot more interesting. And I think when I then purchased and read the book, I thought it was the most enlightening book that I'd read about the First World War in terms of actually understanding what it was like for ordinary people to be mates together here or neighbours or relations, and then to go over there and their encounters with each other in the face of what they were dealing with. And I think what I loved about it was sort of the reality of the dreadfulness, but also the importance of some of the lovelier things. So that was just really, really eye-opening for me to read. So I recommend the book to you highly, but I certainly recommend Robert to you highly as a speaker and researcher of this particular period of history and these men in particular. Robert's going to speak to you for a while, and then he's going to be interviewed by a second fine speaker, Pauline Gleeson, who happens to share my surname and parentage. But I'll introduce Robert first. So, Robert.
Thank you. Sorry, can I just interrupt Robert to ask, does anybody have the remote on their seat? We just seem to have this. Oh, Steve has it.
I knew where it was.
Oh.
Right, well, I might just get started. Thanks very much to Anne, and thank you to Chris also for reopening this lovely chapel. So I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about the book that has been written and published last year. The title is Murphy's War, and it was co-authored by myself and Elizabeth Murphy, who is my maternal aunt. And the project really grew out of Elizabeth's work as family historian and genealogist. You know, she's done a lot of work around her family history in Western Victoria. She knew that there was a group of men from Victoria that were related all in some way. So they were either cousins, or they were friends, or they were family friends. It was a very small, tight-knit group, and she was always very interested in what their story was. And so we set out together, not knowing anything about what was going to happen along the way, and we uncovered a very, very interesting story, and I've actually learned a lot about our history as well along the way. You know, things that I really didn't know about just ordinary Australian men who'd gone off to serve their country, and the sort of experiences that they'd been through. So what I'm going to do is quickly outline for you the 10 men that were involved and what their connections are. And then we'll have Pauline come across, and she's going to ask me a few questions. And from there, we thought we'd probably open it up more to a discussion, because I know, given that we're a week away from the 100th anniversary of the Gallipoli landing, everyone's very interested at the moment in First World War history, and everyone's got a story to tell, everyone's got something they'd like to say. So we'd encourage opening the floor up to a bit of a discussion, and we'll go from there. So, right, the first person that we researched, we ended up looking into the 10 men from a sort of chronological perspective, based on when they enlisted. And so we found out first when they enlisted, and the first to enlist was Jack Foote, and he signed up more or less immediately. So the war breaks out in August 1914, and 2 weeks later he was in the army. He was heading to Melbourne, and he was off on an adventure. He was known as a sort of an outdoorsman, quite a rugged sort of cavalier type guy living out in the bush, and he answered the call straight away, and signed up. Was part of the first group of men to head across, and he ended up being a veteran of the war. He was fighting in the war for almost 4 years. So his story is extremely interesting. But then, following that, the next person to enlist was Benjamin Chandler, and also his cousin James enlisted not long after. And they were from Tarawara, which is next to Healesville, and they would both go and fight on Gallipoli as well. So we have the first three whose story begins in Gallipoli. And following that, the next person to enlist is Charlie McGuinness. And I'm going to show you a few photos later on, but this is Charlie here. I can see that. He signs up, and not long afterwards his friend Frank Murphy signs up as well. So we started to see a pattern whereby if one person would sign up and a friend or a cousin found out about it, not long afterwards, 3 or 4 weeks later, another one would sign up. So there was definitely an aspect of friends wanting to be in it together. They heard about one of their friends deciding, all right, I'm going, so they would go as well. And that was true of Jack Foote's younger brother, Hugh. So Hugh and his friend Jack Cousin signed up on the same day. They both decided that if they went together, then they would be able to keep each other out of trouble. So, and it was quite a common misconception that if the mates just stuck together, then you wouldn't have any problems. And we'll find out further down the track that it's not always the case. And then after that, we have the two brothers who come from Coleraine, and this is the connection to Anne and Pauline and a few other people. Other people in the audience today who are connected to the Shine family. So Jack Shine signs up first, and heads over to France, and not long after that, well, it is sort of a year or so later, but his younger brother Dan signs up as well, and so they're both across. And Jack Shine was a maternal cousin of Frank Murphy, so that's the connection that ties the Murphys and the Shines together. And it's quite interesting that these ties were important throughout the war, and many of the notes that they made or letters that they sent home, they said, "Oh, I met such and such here at this time. You know, we were both stationed in the same area, found out, made some inquiries, and we went and we met each other." So it was definitely these connections. They kept on running into each other. And you think, gee, you know, that it wouldn't be that easy to do, but it happened quite frequently. So I'm not sure if I've forgotten anybody. There was another Chandler, Charles Chandler, who was James Chandler's brother, and he enlisted as well. And Jack Cuzner, we have here. His photo is just here. And so, yeah, that's the 10 men, the basic outline. And what we're going to do now is basically talk about what happened and what their stories were, individual stories together. And to do that, we're going to introduce Pauline, who's going to run over a lot of the material. And we actually have a lot of records, and we've got some maps, and we've got some interesting documents that we're going to talk about, and then we're going to pass them around the room so that people can get a feel for what went into making the story, the sort of research that we did to find out the details, and just prize out the story from what was a very convoluted sort of piece of history. So, yeah, introduce Pauline.
Microphone and testing if you can all hear me. Yes? Yes. Even my Uncle Jack? Can you hear me? Not quite. That's all right. Can you just give us a moment to set ourselves up? We do. So the first person who Robert spoke of was Jack Foote, young Jack Foote, who comes from...
My fault. Jack Foote was living up around the Warwick-McGill area. So at the time, the Western districts aren't particularly populated. There's not that many people up there. But he was living out in a sort of bushman's hut out in the wilderness, and it's quite a long way west. But his family originally came from Lake Bolak, which is not too far from here. And he was one of 4 brothers who were orphaned in 1899. They lost their parents. So the brothers were raised by the O'Rourke family, who were from Lake Bolak. And there were 4 brothers in the Foote family, and we looked at 2 of them, Jack and Hugh. But Jack was by far the most cavalier of all of the men that we looked at, he was, said to be a crack shot and a natural leader of men, and he went through the whole war really, and survived some of the worst battles that the Australians fought in. So he was eventually promoted. He was eventually promoted to lieutenant, having started out as a private. So he climbed all the way up and became a non-commissioned officer, which was becoming more common towards the end of the war with losses.
Okay. And in relation to Jack, we have this casualty form, active service casualty form, that I'll actually pass around and give you all a chance to have a look at that. But perhaps Robert could give us just a quick explanation of what it shows.
Okay, so let's look at later on. Start at the beginning. So Jack is at the Gallipoli landing. So he arrives in Gallipoli and he's straight into the fighting. But the first major battle that he's in is known as the Second Battle of Krithia, and it's a famous battle in Australian military history because the soldiers are asked to charge at the small town of Krithia, which is basically the whole town is just a series of Turkish machine gun posts, and they knew that already, and it was well known that Krithia was almost a fortress, but they were told to do it anyway. And we had an account later on from Jack describing what he went through. They just took off running straight for the town. They didn't really get anywhere near it, but they were eventually they sort of dug in and regrouped themselves, and by the time they came out, most of their battalion was gone. There really wasn't that many people left. So this was one of his initial sort of baptisms by fire, I guess.
Okay. And it then goes on, as I understand it, and shows the various injuries.
Yeah, he became a veteran very rapidly. So he is wounded, I think, twice in Gallipoli. Once is a shrapnel wound to the head, and he suffers also shell concussion and bruised face. Eventually he is transferred off Gallipoli and proceeds in 1916 to France. He is promoted also during this period and becomes a sergeant. And he was one of the men that also went through the Battle of Poitiers, and we believe Mouquet Farm as well, which is two of the major battles that Australians fought in 1916. But his casualty form reads sort of like a laundry list of various wounds that he suffered from. He's gassed in 1917, and he just keeps fighting. He just keeps coming back, and he's an amazingly resilient character.
That's right. And just in relation to Jack, he has this special relationship with his aunt, and there's just a very interesting excerpt from a little letter here that he's written to his aunt, talking about his younger brothers, which I think is this part here.
This section, yeah. So Jack has three younger brothers, and it was common in Australian culture for if one young man going to the army, he could say, I don't want my brothers to go in as well because I've done enough. In the case of the First World War, the demand for more and more soldiers was so high that more and more brothers kept joining. But I'll just read quickly from this letter home from Jack, who he's obviously been told that his brothers are thinking of enlisting because they know that he's over there fighting. And it says, "It worries me to have them here. I'd sooner be on my own because one never knows when one is going out to it."
We'll let you have a look at it.
You can try and design. It's very, very small handwriting, but he basically wrote home to his aunt very candidly about what the conditions were like for him and his soldiers, and he was really trying to discourage his younger brothers from joining in France.
The character in this story who really stands out for all of us, I think, is Frank Murphy, because his diaries are so beautifully written, and the lovely lilting prose takes you through. Anne's telling me you can't hear me.
Is that better? Tuck that out of the way. Oh, that's much better. I can hear it echoing back. Excuse me. Anyway, this lovely lilting prose takes you through various parts of the French countryside. We travel with him to Paris, and at one point we travel with him to Ireland. This is a sample of the diaries and the work that Robert and Elizabeth had to do to try and discern this lovely lilting writing. And I'll hand that to Robert for a moment and let him show us how clever he is.
Right, so Frank Murphy is the closest family connection that I have to this story. And so he was my maternal great uncle, and I'd always known that his war diaries existed. You know, people had often talked about them, but I'd never seen them. I knew that they were out there, and I've actually got some correspondence between me and Elizabeth when I was still in high school, so it's maybe more than 15 years ago. We were already corresponding about the diary, and eventually she did get a copy of it, and it kind of looks like this. We'll certainly show you, but it's very small, written in tiny handwriting in indelible pencil. And it took us a very long time to translate it, and there was sort of 2 years of research really that were dedicated to just figuring out names and dates from this thing. But once we had translated it, and we really found a very interesting story, and it really illuminated a lot of the connections as well that we'd set out to discover in finding out about these 10 men. So this was a major part of the project, and as a result we took Frank Murphy's voice and we recreated it into a first-person narrative. So half of the book is actually observations of life on the front lines as a field ambulance stretcher bearer, and it's told through his voice. So this was one way for us to really, I guess, explore a different perspective of the war, which was his perspective.
And one of the things that's very interesting about Frank's story is he does, as I say, have this lovely lilting writing, and when he's more relaxed. But then there's a point in the book where his writing is quite staccato,
So, Jack, we have the date here, 29th of October, 1917. So, he's been into Wandsworth Hospital, military hospital in England, and the date that he goes in there is the 14th of October 1917. So, about 10 days previously was one of the major battles that Australians took part in the First World War in Belgium, and this is the Battle of Rusinga. And it's really a terrible battle for the Australians in terms of loss of life, but it was considered a victory in that the Australians were given a job to do, and they did their job, and they achieved their targets for that battle. And so we figured out that this was the battle in which Jack was wounded, and he was the story that was passed down through his relatives to Elizabeth. Elizabeth is really excellent at mining people for information, and she found out that Jack was essentially left for dead. He was wounded, shot in the arm, or it must have been in the arm, and he fell down in a pile of other bodies, and his mates thought, oh well, he's done for, we've got to carry on. But it turned out that he had survived.
And here we all are. Thank you, Jack. Does anyone want to ask any questions? I don't really want to dominate this. And if I could just prompt something, is there anyone here who has any other connection with the people in the story? No other connections? Immediate family connections? No?
Of the 10 who you're talking about, how many of them came back home?
Right, so it's an interesting question, and it is really the...
That's you, Polly.
Is that you?
It's all right. This is all trial and error.
So, it was an interesting cross-section. Most of the people that we looked at were from rural communities, so they were farmers or they were labourers and that sort of thing, so they went into the lowest rung of the army. They were all privates. Some of them, like Jack Foote, we heard he climbed up the ladder, but none of them were commissioned, so they went into a certain role in the army, but two of them were killed. Charles Chandler went in to the Somme at the end of 1916, and he was on active duty for about 3 months, and he was killed. And we found more or less the place where he was killed, and we matched up within sort of a day or two his battalion to which battle was going on. And Jack Kusner also was killed. He was killed in 1917 at the Battle of the name escapes me now. We will, yeah. It's the major battle of 1917. At the beginning of 1917 for the Australians, it's the Battle of Bullecourt, which is very well known. And he was working as a batman to a lieutenant, and his lieutenant was leading his men in the charge, and he was wounded. So his batman ran out and picked him up, and as they were heading back to the aid station, they were both hit by a shell and killed. So of the 10, two die in battle, and of the remaining 8, none of them really returned unscathed. There was a definite pattern that there was always either, in the case of Jack Shine, there was amputation, so two of the men were amputees. One of the men was severely shell-shocked, and according to reports, he never went back to normal. He was never the same person. And this was James Chandler, who went back to Tarawara, and his family reported that, you know, he used to run out and grab his gun and shoot at invisible enemies. You know, the war was still going on for him, and for a lot of men that came back, it never really ended. It's just really part of the story.
With this condition of shell shock, I suspect I'm not working in. Is that working? No? Can you hear any? Tell us a bit about the shell shock, please, Robert, and it's a brief description of the particular effect it had on James, but you talk about the condition just really emerging in the First World War and the medical profession just becoming aware of it at that time and not knowing how to treat it and regarding people as trying to get out of the fight rather than really being genuinely ill.
Yeah, that's right. So prior to the First World War, there weren't any major wars with explosive munitions used, so what we would call shells. Prior to that, it was still cannonball in the 19th century, and while this did a lot of damage, it had a different effect on the soldiers. So there's a new technology, which is the high explosive shell, and the soldiers in the First World War are the first men to be exposed to repeated bombardment from explosive shells, which causes concussion to spread out around the area of the explosion. But it actually was causing a medical condition which was affecting the central nervous system of people's bodies. And it was having very, very strange effects on the soldiers coming out of battle. But for the first 2 years of the war, the army certainly didn't accept that it was a real condition, and the medical officers and those sort of people knew that something was going on, but they couldn't put their finger on what was causing it. So for a lot of people that were suffering from shell shock, which the army sort of eventually recognised and referred to it as neurasthenia.
And how did it manifest itself? What was the effect on people?
Well, you know, one of the clear effects of soldiers coming out was uncontrollable shaking. So they would come out and they couldn't stop moving. You know, they would lose their sort of mobility. You know, they'd lose their balance. They couldn't walk straight. You know, but they would anything that I guess you would say anything that you need to rely on your central nervous system for could be affected by it. So in this case, speech was one of the major things. You know, people were coming out of battle and they couldn't talk properly. They couldn't describe what was wrong with them or how they were feeling. You know, they were just sort of you'd say nervous wreck. But
And for many people, did it last for many years afterwards? We have the description of James, and it lasting for many. Did other people get over it? What was the general?
Look, there were people that suffered from it, and for long periods after the war, and people were sent into psychiatric institutions, and they didn't come out. And for them, you know, they were affected in ways where they still felt like the war was continuing. Even after the war had ended, they were locked up thinking that the war was going on. So it did have an effect on the psychology of returned soldiers, and actually the psychiatry at the time was a new discipline, and a lot of the advances that they made in that field were thanks to the work that they did with returned soldiers.
I just had one other medical condition that I was a bit interested in, which was trench feet. Tell us about trench feet. What happened to you? What actually happened to your foot? And after that, I'm not asking any more questions. It's up to the rest of you.
So, trench feet was really a product of the conditions that the men were fighting in, especially in France in 1916. So everybody's probably heard of the Somme, or the Battle of the Somme. This was it begins in July of 1916 in the French summer, and the plan is that it will be a big breakthrough, and everyone will storm through, break the German lines, and the war will be over by Christmas. And actually that didn't happen. It was the largest single disaster, single worst day in British military history. Nearly 20,000 soldiers are killed on one day, and after that they keep fighting the Battle of the Somme. It goes on for another 4.5 months, and in the meantime the conditions get much worse. So you've got shelling on both sides, so all of the ground is getting blown up, and then it starts to rain. So you essentially have what is, mud doesn't even really describe it. It's like this sort of thick, watery paste that's covered everything. That's what everybody's living in. But for the soldiers and for their day-to-day sort of existence, if their feet are under the water, in this kind of mud for long enough, the feet actually start to rot, and this became known as trench feet, and they had to. It was very debilitating for various units, and they had to take them out of the lines and treat this condition before they could go back in, and at times it would affect half or 2/3 of the battalion. So it was reducing the strength of the battalions, and in the most severe cases, men would die from trench.
So was it a gangrene?
I think it's a form of gangrene. I'm not entirely sure, but I know on Gallipoli as well, they had another condition which was called Baku rot or something like that. So the conditions there created a state where the men's feet were rotting as well. And they had to be taken out and treated for that. But if it wasn't treated, it could be fatal. So.
Okay.
I think it was a type of tinea that just got, with the skin just sort of broke down. And, the skin gets all weak when it's wet all the time.
Yeah.
So when the dishes gets macerated, it gets white.
Yeah.
I think the skin got white, fungi got in,
And
and then there was no antibiotics, so bacteria would get through the broken down skin, and then you would get infected feet, which no antibiotics, and you either have to cut them off, or the person would die of septicemia. That's sort of what it amounted to.
Yeah, and it looked like as if the feet were rotting.
Yeah, because the skin was just breaking down
Skin
with
would break
fungal
off.
infection,
Yeah.
which just never went away, and there's no treatment for it.
Yeah.
I've promised you no more questions, but there is someone.
Robert, could you speak little bit about the men connecting with each other in the battlefield?
Yep. Okay. So the most information that we had was from Frank Murphy. And he was a member of the 8th Field Ambulance, and that meant that he was moving around a lot. So the Field Ambulance they were essentially on the move all the time. So if a battle was going on 1 or 2 kilometres behind the lines, a whole chain of medical stations would be set up, which would lead to the hospital, and the field ambulance had to go back and forward between the front lines, which were extremely dangerous for a field ambulance, and then all the way back to the hospital. And he was working as a stretcher bearer mainly, but doing other jobs as well. And the field ambulance was extremely mobile, so they would be moved from one part of the sector to another and back again. They were moving around. So he had the opportunity to actually find out which battalion was nearby and make inquiries to see if any of his cousins or any of his friends from back home or anybody was around. And what we found was constant references to meeting people from home, or meeting people that he trained with in Ballarat, or meeting people from Seymour, or, from the guys from the footy team back home. It was such a big thing. They didn't have a lot of opportunity to really spend time with each other, but they would see each other and they would run into each other quite frequently. So I guess to put it into context, the British area of operations in France was only really 85 miles across. It's quite a small area, so the Australians got quite good at figuring out where their friends might be and tracking them down, I guess. Yeah. But the other aspect is that they did have quite a lot of spare time, which it doesn't always sound that logical, but following a major battle where a unit would suffer 50 or 60 or sometimes higher % casualties, they'd have to take them out of the line and rebuild the strength with reinforcements. So in that time, they had all this free time to explore France, and they were organising sort of trips with each other and trying to catch up with friends and that sort of thing. So we really went into that. It's the other side of the story, which is all these people are living these lives, and at times the story turned into a kind of a travel log. It was doing the sights of this town, and
Going to the pub at this town.
Going to the pub here. And,
playing footy.
Yeah, so the men were, when they were stationed around Amiens, this is the area of France known as Picardy, and there was a famous sort of tourist manual, I guess, written by some English guy called Pepys of Picardy, and it had all of the tourist spots in Picardy, and it used to go around between the men, and they would go out and explore these towns and look for fun or excitement, that sort of thing. So, we did have certainly in the diaries you'd get references to where the men met each other. So before the major battles of 1917 started, Frank Murphy and Jack Shine met at a train station, and I think later on they went back and they sort of had a night together and that sort of thing. But it's possible they wouldn't have seen each other for 2 years prior to that, but you know, you never know. We're just sort of hunting for these little connections, but it really made it quite fascinating for us.
Robert, you're a young man, and I can't imagine that there wouldn't have been many times whilst you were researching and writing this book that you wouldn't have asked yourself, you know, what would I have done? How would I have felt? How would I have reacted? Could you comment, please?
Yes. Well, it's a very interesting question, and I guess part of it is all of these men that were very young. You know, in a lot of cases they were still teenagers, or you know, only in their very early 20s, and maybe hadn't had a lot of education. They believed a lot of the things that they were told about the war and what it was going to be like, and they accepted it. But from my perspective, it was really important, I guess, to try to put myself in their shoes, so to speak. And I thought a lot about what their experiences were and what they went through and what they sacrificed in the context of the society that we have now, and essentially how well off we are by comparison. You know, our generation is really quite lucky when you can compare it to previous generations that went through these sort of major events. And I guess, yeah, that sort of perspective does, it makes you feel quite lucky, I guess. Yeah.
Anyone else? No?
I will say one further thing in that regard. Of the people that have read the book so far, the older generations have really enjoyed it. And when I was writing, I really had my generation in mind. Like, I really wanted to create something that could speak to people from my generation of the sort of sacrifices that previous generations of Australians went through. So it's been difficult to get through to my generation, but there are people out there that are interested. So yeah, for me it was a major motivation, I guess, in writing the book.
And if I could ask another question, please.
Of course you can.
Of this group of men who they went away as quite young boys, really, when they came back after a relatively, short time, although it must have been an interminably long time to them, did you get the idea that they had really aged far more than those 3 or 4 years that they'd been away, that they went away as boys and came away as really almost old men?
Yeah, I think it was quite common, that they really grew old before their time, and they grew old thanks to what they experienced, which is, I guess, more than anybody should have to experience in life. But it was such a terrible conflict, and the devastation and the loss of life. There was a lot of what we would now call survivor's guilt, because a lot of the men lost their friends or their mates. A lot of people didn't come back, and people, they're often left asking why me and not them, or vice versa. So it was a fairly common question. But the other side of that was that this was a generation that when they came back, they didn't talk about the war particularly much. The war was left very much as a silence for a long time. It was we know that the veterans would trust each other, and you know, they had a certain bond with each other from having been through the same scene, but it wasn't something that was really spoken about openly in the post-war years. It was something more to be forgotten. You know, you heard more stories of packing up all of the army stuff, putting it in the trunk and just, you know, putting it in the attic and just forget about it. I think Australia was largely a nation in mourning during the 1920s, and people wanted to forget about what had happened rather than to keep thinking about it, I guess.
So that packing up your troubles in your kit bag and just putting that bag aside and then smiling, even though you wouldn't have felt like smiling.
Yeah, it's very common. And we have a photograph of James Chandler who suffered from shell shock when he was back. And he's there with one of his mates from the army who's got an army hat on, but neither of them are in uniform. And it always struck me that it looked like he would have said, I don't want any, you know, you can have your hat, but I don't want the photo taken in uniform. You know, it was more just, we're not going to sort of celebrate the fact that we've been in the army or that we served. We just want to move on. Sort of thing.
May I read you a very brief passage from the book to wind us up?
Please.
This is Frank on the 4th of November 1917. The faintest of faint light creeps through cracks in the rickety door of the dugout, and I wake with the start. I glance at my watch and chuckle as it reads 5:30, and I think, good for another 2 hours at least. And I nestle down, and on comes that delightful drowsiness that is begotten by a warm bed when one knows it's freezing heavens outside. And then he goes on and he talks for a couple of pages about a dream. And the dream that he's actually talking about is the dream of him being back at home teaching his pupils. So he talks about the dream, and then sadly there's a sad end to the dream. I'll let you read it yourselves. But he then goes on and he talks about his actual work. 4 cold and tired bearers grouped over the stretcher, which appears with its load little more than a crumpled heap in the darkness. This is the body that they've collected. Another broken human. We each grasp a handle with a sort of stately, weary precision. All set? All set is the call. Up she goes, says a voice, as the stretcher handles rest upon shoulders and the bearers step off slowly toward the road. Soon comes all the usual chatter to break up the early morning silence. Look out for that shell hole there. Mind that wire. Keep over there. You keep over. I was nearly down that hole. You watch yourself. And on like this, with an endless litany of shouted injunctions passed one to the other. And so it goes on. Great book.
So I guess the comment, what we ended up with was less a history of the battles and that sort of thing, but more of a kind of collection of the minutiae of the day-to-day life of these people as they were doing their jobs under very, very difficult circumstances. Yeah.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks, everyone.